Good evening, I'm Klaudia Czerwińska and you're watching World News Tonight, live from Warsaw. Ukrainian and Russian negotiators began a second round of US-brokered talks in Abu Dhabi on Wednesday, seeking to advance efforts with the continent's largest conflict since World War II. Is there a chance of a peace agreement being reached? We'll try to find an answer to this question in a moment, but first, let's take a look at tonight's headlines. Polish church sends emergency aid to Kyiv amid Ukraine's winter energy crisis. After completing trade deals with India and South America, the EU sets its sight on Australia. And Bulgaria copes with joining the Eurozone. As the second round of US-brokered talks in Abu Dhabi continue, the four-year anniversary of the full-scale war approaches with apparently no peace in sight. The eyes of the world were on the Emirati capital on Wednesday, where the first day of trilateral talks between the US, Ukraine and Russia took place, only a day after Russia's largest missile attack against Ukraine this winter. Despite popular belief, could the talks exceed expectations? Piotr Mistruk has the latest.
Almost 4 years of fighting. And still no peace deal is expected from the second round of US-brokered talks between Russia and Ukraine in Abu Dhabi after the first day of a two-day summit.
Honestly, I don't expect anything new. I think everything will be the same as previous negotiations.
I don't believe it will change anything. We will not give in, nor will they.
That's a popular sentiment across Ukraine.
The Ukrainian population, overwhelmingly, like 70% of the population, has no expectation of any progress in the peace talks in 2026, and only a minority expect something productive to happen in 2027.
The key aspect regarding Ukraine's territorial concessions has yet to be resolved.
When it comes to the most sensitive and complex issues, such as territorial issues, including the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, our position remains unchanged. We believe that these issues should be discussed at the leadership level, and President Zelensky has been and still remains ready for such a meeting.
And the current Russian delegation doesn't seem to have much clout.
If you look at these Abu Dhabi discussions, then Russians were not present on the level that has the right to make decisions. So they are not really taking this seriously.
Another issue is Russia's intensified shelling of Ukraine.
When one side carries out such massive shelling targeting civilians, heating and energy facilities, it hinders the diplomatic process.
However, despite Russia's attacks, Washington's response was less than forceful.
I spoke with the president about it this morning, and his reaction was unfortunately unsurprised. These are two countries who have been engaged in a very brutal war for several years, a war that would have never started if the president were still in office.
But the Ukrainian stance remains unswerving.
Russia must feel pressure so that it complies with partners' requests and genuinely moves towards peace negotiations. So far, only Ukraine is expected to make concessions. Russia must make concessions, and the most important one is to stop the aggression. The one who started the war must take steps towards de-escalation and ending the war.
It's been more than a year since Trump reassumed the US presidency.
The President-elect of the United States, the Honorable Donald John Trump.
And yet he still seems far from stopping the war he promised to end within 24 hours of re-election in 2025. For TVP World, I'm Piotr Mistruk.
This is a war crime committed by Russia, said Ukraine's energy minister Denys Shmyhal, referring to the gargantuan destruction caused by Russia's largest winter attack to date. But as Moscow continues to orchestrate and deepen the humanitarian crisis, assistance is arriving from Poland. More on the latest in Laura Hazanov's report.
As diplomatic efforts begin in Abu Dhabi, hopes for progress remain fragile.
It was Sunday to Sunday, and it opened up, and he hit him hard last night. No, he kept his word on that.
Those words come as Russian forces launched more than 100 drones across Ukraine overnight, following a declared ceasefire on energy infrastructure.
The reality is nothing changed. One of the key things to remember is that these Russian strikes go in cycles, and then once the ceasefire, quote unquote, was finished, they followed up with yet another large strike, exactly the pattern. So nothing changed here.
Although most of the drones were intercepted, strikes and falling debris hit locations throughout Ukraine, again targeting civilian buildings and critical infrastructure. Multiple casualties have been recorded.
Obviously, the war will end through negotiations, but it won't happen this month or even this year. People will continue to die. And I really don't want Ukrainians to wait for that day, because it will not come.
In the midst of a brutal winter, more than 1,000 apartment blocks remain without heating, and in Kharkiv, a power plant has been declared beyond repair.
The Dernitska combined heat and power plant, which focuses solely on producing heat for people, sustained severe damage. This is a Russian war crime.
It's dark and cold. No power, no heat. I just want to write something to my family. The connection is very poor. No internet, no electricity. Nothing at all.
Despite the ongoing violence, international aid efforts race to help Ukrainians endure the cold. 182 generators, more than 900 heaters and 12 tons of food, funded through parish collections across Poland.
In just the first week, we managed to collect over 309,000 euros in the account of Caritas in Kraków. And all of it came from private donations by people who responded to the needs that are clearly evident in Kiev. At the moment, the status of this fundraising effort is almost 711,000 euros.
And while talks continue, far from the front lines, another frigid night falls over Ukraine. For TVP World, Laura Hazanov.
European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen is set to put pen to paper on yet another trade deal, this time with Australia. The EU executive is planning to sign off on the deal, which had been stalled since 2023 on her trip down under later this month. Joining me with more is our correspondent in Brussels, Alex Cadier. Good evening, Alex. So Ursula von der Leyen might have booked her flights, but is this a done deal?
Yeah, good evening, Claudia. In a word, no, it really isn't. Now, we have seen these kinds of signing ceremonies before by the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. On the 17th of January, she signed off on the Mercosur trade deal with those countries over in Brazil. It is still not through the European Parliament. It has still not been rolled out. Now, there is still the legislative process to go through. Now, of course, the Commission and Ursula von der Leyen have a mandate from the member states to go negotiate this trade deal. But still, the European Parliament's going to have to take a look at it. The European Council is going to have to look at it after that as well. So there's still a long road for this to become a law. There is also a meeting between the Trade Commissioner Maros Sefcovic next week and Dan Farrell, his Australian counterpart, here in Brussels to hammer out the details, to hammer out the quotas of what this deal might look like. And crucially, unlike the trade deal with India that we saw recently, this deal involves agriculture, which means farmers in the European Union already sending out warnings that beef, sheep meat, rice and other agricultural products under a lot of pressure in the European Union. This deal cannot add to that pressure, according to the farmers. So, of course, Ursula von der Leyen, we understand, mid-February planning to go to Australia if next week's meetings with the Trade Commissioner go well. But then there's the legislative process and making sure the farmers are happy. Claudia.
Thank you so much, Alex, for an update. This was Alex Cadier reporting live from Brussels. If confirmed, this could be an interference not seen in space before. 2 Russian spacecraft are believed to be responsible for intercepting European satellites, potentially risking compromising sensitive information and allowing the Kremlin to manipulate orbital trajectories. This development follows increased shadowing of European satellites by Russia over the past 3 years. Sonia Gatabishan has this report.
European officials believe that their communications have been targeted by Moscow, says the Financial Times. The data backs the suspicion as Russian spacecrafts like the Luch 2 have been getting dangerously close to European satellites like Intelsat 39 the past few years.
These satellites come close to telecommunication satellites, and when we say close, it's a few dozen of kilometers typically, and they stay there for a few days. Sometimes a few weeks, and then leave and go to the next targets.
Analysts have noted increased tracking activity since Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine, in particular since its launch in 2023. Luch 2, a Russian military geosatellite, has reportedly come close to 17 European satellites, their mere proximity sounding alarm bells.
Geostationary Earth orbit satellites usually have a given slot defined by the longitude, and they're not supposed to move from these slots. So yeah, like 10 kilometers in geo is very close, is unusual, and it can be considered as a threat for satellite operators.
European satellites tracked by Russia serve mainly civilian uses, such as beaming satellite television into homes, but also contain sensitive government and military communications. Experts note the risk of Moscow spacecraft possibly deducing how European satellites work and using that information against them.
The effect could be a loss of communication in the, I would say, best case, and in the worst case, it could be misleading maneuvers for the European satellite, and it could lead to dramatic event on orbit, like a collision.
Last week, European Commissioner Andrius Kubilius acknowledged that member states fear that war is coming. Consequently, he requested that Europe's new secure connectivity constellation, IRIS² rolls out quicker than expected to strengthen the region as soon as possible.
This is very much what IRIS² is meant to do, is increase the resilience of the SATCOM infrastructure, ensure that there are secure communication links and secure communication systems that can be used and that can provide again, communications that cannot be or are way harder to be interfered with.
IRIS² is considered a response to Elon Musk's Starlink, providing secure and encrypted communication services. The EU's multi-orbital constellation of 290 satellites was supposed to launch in 2030, but in the current geopolitical context, Kubilius now eyes 2029. For TVP World, I'm Sonia Agatabishchan.
Could the expiry of the landmark nuclear arms control treaty between the United States and Russia lead to a new nuclear arms race? According to the Norwegian Prime Minister, we could be at a dangerous turning point for global security. The official urged Washington, Moscow, and Beijing to return to negotiations, as most Russian intercontinental missiles remain aimed at the United States. Adam Yasser is in Tromsø, Norway, and has this next report.
Norway, Poland and allies bordering Russia are discussing how to deter the country from new aggression if there is a ceasefire or peace in Ukraine. That's according to Norway's Prime Minister Jonas Støre here at the Arctic Conference in Tromsø, Norway. Norway shares a long border with Russia in the Arctic, facing off Moscow's massive nuclear arsenal and navy just a few hundred kilometers away. The Norwegian leader said he did not see an imminent threat of a conflict with Russia, but wasn't taking peace for granted.
As a government, when we consult our military and we consult our intelligence, that there is an imminent threat against Norway. Actually, for the time being, there is less of that because they are consumed by Ukraine. Fewer people and less equipment. But obviously, a country that is re-establishing the Leningrad military district is a country we have to watch out for.
I asked Prime Minister Støre if Norway saw the risk that any ceasefire in Ukraine could make Putin turn up the heat in the Arctic. And here is his reply.
Russia is now recreating its Leningrad military district. That affects the northeastern part of Russia, close to us. And when we are planning our defense posture towards 2030, it is with that in mind. You know, if this war ends, and it should end, what will be Russia's relations with its neighbors? I had my Polish colleague in my office 2 days ago, or the Polish foreign minister, discussing this. And what we see is that the Nordic Baltic countries, together with Poland and Germany, are in a much closer discussion on how we will collaborate and keep each other informed about these issues.
The Norwegian Prime Minister expressed alarm at Thursday's expiry of the landmark nuclear arms control treaty between Russia and the United States. He urged Washington and Moscow, as well as China, to return to negotiations. While Norway, Poland and others on the eastern flank are concerned about Russia's tactical, short-range nuclear weapons, the Norwegian leader made a point that most ballistic intercontinental missiles were aimed at the United States. Speaking to 1,500 delegates, including US officials, he recalled having to remind President Trump about this reality.
I heard President Trump in Davos 2 weeks ago, where he said something like this: we have given everything to NATO, NATO has given nothing back to us. And I'm a diplomat, so I will say, Mr. President, that is wrong. I have a few other words in my head, but I think this is a sober way of saying it.
Despite keeping a cautious tone throughout his presentation here, the Norwegian premier said Norway would boost its military spending this year to 3.5% of GDP, roughly $16 billion. That highlights that the age of peaceful cooperation in the Arctic between Russia and the West is for now over. From Tromsø, Norway, I'm Adam Yasser.
It's been a month since Bulgaria became the newest member of the Eurozone. In this next report, Maciej Wilowski takes a closer look to see if the boogeyman of high prices and inflation materialized after the country adopted the new currency. Here's more.
It's been just over a month since Bulgaria adopted the euro, and so far, prices have not shot up as some people had feared they would. In fact, price increases are slowing. According to preliminary figures published by Bulgaria's National Statistical Institute, inflation in Bulgaria fell to 3.6% in January compared to December's 5%. Lower inflation across the Eurozone as a whole may have helped. Euro area inflation eased to 1.7% last month, tying with September 2024 for the lowest rate since 2021. There's another factor at play. Since 1999, Bulgaria's currency, the lev, has been pegged to the euro at a value of roughly 2 to 1, helping to smoothen the transition.
Bulgaria currency leva was pegged to Deutschmark first and then to euro. So I do not expect any major impact on inflation from adopting euro.
The decades-long currency peg could make Bulgaria's transition process unique compared to other past Eurozone entrants like Croatia.
Croatia before with kuna had not been pegged on euro in the same way as leva in Bulgaria.
To be sure, Bulgaria's consumers are still feeling the pinch financially after months of high inflation, often exceeding 5%.
When we observe the voice of the street, people indeed have the sense of increased prices.
And a lower inflation rate, in other words, disinflation, does not mean that prices are going down.
Disinflation is just a slowing down of inflation. So stuff like goods and services still is getting more expensive, but in slower pace than before. Disinflation doesn't mean that things are getting cheaper.
Bulgaria is the European Union's 21st member state to adopt the common currency, 19 years after the country was admitted into the EU. And a one-month transition period when citizens could still pay using the lev is now over.
At this point, since February 1st in Bulgaria, already the only official currency is euro.
Euro adoption has come amid a years-long political crisis that shows no signs of letting up. In December, anti-corruption protests forced the resignation of the government, setting the stage for Bulgaria's 8th parliamentary election in just 5 years. That prompted Bulgaria's president, Rumen Radev, to resign from his position in January so that he could run in the upcoming general election. Though it may be too soon to draw conclusions, Bulgaria's transition to the euro has been a smooth one so far, with inflation kept under control. Maciej Wilowski for TVP World.
And now looking back at the first day of the Trilateral talks in Abu Dhabi, revolving around the subject of the end to the war in Ukraine and more. Joining me on the program to really dissect the latest is Ivana Stradner, Research Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Ivana, great pleasure to have you back on the program as always.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
So let's start from the top. Russia broke the promise that was given to President Trump. They broke the ceasefire with Ukraine, but President Trump claims that Putin kept his promise, saying, quote, "It was meant to be from Sunday to Sunday." Is this how the tragedy of Ukrainian people and their safety should be measured in calendar days?
I believe that Putin's attack on critical infrastructure and energy tells us all we need to know where negotiations are going, because actions speak louder than words. And of course, Putin is going to continue giving false promises to Washington, and Washington, unfortunately, is still going to fall for those promises. And of course, Putin is going to claim that that he had to, launch all those attacks because Russia was attacked. So all those typical things, this is really nothing new. And that's why we have to really zoom out and to ask ourselves once again, why are we still negotiating with Russia? And the answer is very, very simple. Putin wants to continue negotiations to buy more time, position military, and to continue. Because 2026 is important for Putin because his economy is not doing well and he needs to buy more time.
So it's following what you just said. Putin seems to be trying to buy time when it comes to rebuilding his military power to possibly reach even further. But on Monday, the U.S. signed a deal with India. We know that the sanctions on India were lifted. We know that in return, India is going to stop its oil imports from Russia as part of the agreement, and this equals to 35% of total oil exports by Russia. How do you think that this is going to affect the Russian war machine? And is it going to have an influence on this time buying by Vladimir Putin?
I'm glad that you asked me this question because it's very important to understand that President Trump is first and foremost a businessman, and he wants to target Russia's center of gravity. He also believes probably that negotiation is just another set of words, but what will really hurt Putin hard is actually to target his economy. And I think talking with India about stop buying relying on Russian energy sources, it's extremely important. My concern is that there are still numerous question marks within that agreement. Russia doesn't seem to worry about this. So let's see, what is going to happen. I think it's extremely important right now to impose secondary sanctions on all countries that are buying Russian gas and oil and that are relying on Russian energy. That will hurt Putin more. And I also believe what happened with Venezuela and the U.S. threats on Iran, it also signals a very clear message to Vladimir Putin that Washington is still serious about harming Russia's in a way that are not maybe, direct in terms of, having a direct war with Russia. There are ways still that we can leverage and to put Putin on the defensive. So while many people in the West love to put that gloom and doom scenario, talking how President Trump is going to throw Ukraine under the bus, I think it's really important to pause and to see the big picture. Yes, Putin is buying more time, and that's something that concerns me in the long run. But in the short run, I do believe that Putin is going to feel the consequences. And my last point to that is we also have to understand that Putin is working very, very close with China. And if America's national security doctrines and documents talk about that, that's our key problem, China, we also have to remove that leverage from Beijing, that has been using Russia as a proxy.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned some unconventional ways in which President Trump is approaching problems that come his way, and you mentioned Russia, but you also stressed that the U.S. is not going to get itself, especially with the new START expiring tomorrow, it's not going to get itself involved in a full guns, all guns blazing exchange with Russia. But what kind of unconventional ways do you think President Trump could possibly have, in your opinion, to make Vladimir Putin convince again?
You just mentioned the New START treaty, and indeed it's expiring, and Putin has been using that nuclear threats as a weapon for a very long time to deter the West, whether policymakers were sitting in Brussels or Washington, D.C. Every time when the United States was supposed to provide Ukraine with more weapons, Putin would issue nuclear threats. And one thing that I think it's very important to note is that President Trump didn't fall for those threats. When Medvedev threatened with nukes, President Trump said, okay, basically fine, I'm going to, remove and to move nuclear submarines closer to Russia, to summarize, what happens. So he removed that nuclear threat. But to go back, so that's something we should absolutely not fear, because Putin is understanding nuclear weapons as a cognitive weapon of war. But what are other unconventional ways that we can harm the Kremlin? Number one thing is we still have to impose secondary sanctions and more sanctions on countries that rely on Russia's energy, as I mentioned, and not only the United States, but also Europe. The second thing is I believe that it's extremely important that the United States within NATO work very closely on Russia's hybrid war, because that's on the horizon. Make no mistake, Putin is going to continue to challenge Europe. And why the United States should care about that? It's precisely because that is going to deteriorate unity within NATO. The third pillar that I believe that it's extremely important to continue to do is basically to be ready to provide Ukraine with all the weapons that Ukraine needs to put Russia on the defensive if Russia decides not to move forward with negotiations. And the fourth thing that I also believe that it's extremely important to pursue is also the question of the Arctic, because that's something that Putin deeply cares about, and removing that from negotiation table that Russia has been trying to do is immense importance. But to do that, I think that Washington has to understand that peace through trade never worked, and it will never work. Why am I emphasizing that? Because Russia keeps sending envoy who has been talking constantly about the U.S., Russia, economic developments and cooperation. And that's a form of psychological warfare that we should not fall for. And my last point to that is just as Putin really freaked out what happened in Venezuela, and he's very uncomfortable with what's happening with Iran, also targeting Russia's other allies, basically showing that Putin is not a reliable ally, will be very important, because make no mistake, Putin threw Venezuela under the bus. He might well, throw Iran under the bus. And we already know how Iran has been working closely with Russia.
Mm-hmm. Ivana, I wanted to, right before we go, dive a little bit deeper on the subject of the New START agreement that expires tomorrow, that was signed in 2010 between the U.S. and Russia, as you have a particular vantage point when it comes to that very topic. A lot of people are concerned. Do you think that with that expiry taking place on Wednesday, we are actually going to see a new arms race, and we're on the verge of it?
I was smiling because indeed a lot of people are concerned, but I'm not. Because if you read carefully Russian national security documents, you will understand that for Russian nuclear weapons serve two functions. Number one, as a prestige, basically to show that Russia is a great power. And the second thing is for Russia to use that as a deterrence, but as a psychological warfare, because Putin understands perfectly that people fear nuclear weapons, that people remember the Cold War, and nobody wants Armageddon. So if you go back and use backward induction since 2022, how many times Putin actually threatened the West with nukes, and so many times we fell for those threats, That tells you all you need to know what Putin is up to when it comes to nukes. Second thing is Putin doesn't have a rational incentive to use nuclear weapons. Why? Because he's already accomplishing all of his goals with nuclear, threats, and that we are falling for that. And he believes deep inside that he has time and that he can buy more time and that he is eventually going to win this war. But to do that, he has to create the perception that Russia has to be feared. So that's precisely why the West should not worry about employment or arms race when it comes to Russia, because Putin has no rational incentive to use nuclear weapons. Of course, that doesn't mean that maybe tactical nuclear weapons it's a different story, but I don't want to dive deeper into that topic. What's important right now is that we have to understand that for Putin, that START agreement was just a piece of paper, and all those agreements are nothing more than just words on a piece of paper for Putin.
Ivana, thank you so much. Ivana Stradner, Research Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, was my guest on the program. Pleasure to have you as always.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
And so this would be all for now. Thank you so much for joining. I'm Klaudia Czerwińska, and I hope to see you back here for more news and features on TVP World in just a moment.